Good day to everyone tuning in to this. My name is Gordon Harris from the Gowling WLG Global IP Leadership Team, and I would like to welcome you to the first in what will be a series of informal conversations with leading figures in the world of intellectual property. We're hoping that by talking to people who are involved in the world of IP in a variety of different capacities, we can build a picture of how the IP world works and get some insight into trends and likely developments. Today, I'm talking with Simon Forrester, the Group IP Director, which translates to Head of IP at Dyson. Simon, thank you very much for joining us today.
No, it's nice to be here, Gordon.
I wonder if I might start by having a little look at your rise to this important position. Where did you start out in the IP world and how did you get here?
Well, where did I start? Well, I'm a patent attorney by profession. And actually, I didn't start in-house at all. So like many people in my profession, I started in private practice and I spent 10 years in private practice, mostly in London and then in Bristol. And I enjoyed the work. And then one day I received a call from an ex-colleague who I'd used to work with in London. He'd left the profession actually and had gone traveling and had ended up back in the profession at Dyson. And he gave me a call one day out of the blue and he said that they were looking for an attorney at Dyson. And I'd come to mind as somebody who might be a pretty good fit. And did I want to go in to talk to them? So I said yes. I went in, I spoke to the then head of IP and we got on pretty well. And the rest, as they say, is history. Along the way, I had quite a few different roles. I had good exposure to lots of different categories. I was lucky enough to get involved in a bit of litigation along the way. And so when the head of IP retired, I was in a reasonably good position to step into the role.
Yep, indeed. And of course, it's quite a role, isn't it? Dyson is a business which has very much emphasized the importance of IP. I remember some of its early television commercials even used to boast about how many patents protected a single device, even if Victoria would pronounce the word patents wrong. The company has also been involved in a number of high-profile litigation cases with patents, designs, and brands. So how does that affect your approach to the role and the responsibility it entails, IP being so central to Dyson's very being, if you like?
Yeah, I think the short answer to that, Gordon, is that I'm very much in the spotlight. You know, it's interesting. If you were to ask me the question generally about Dyson and the last 10 years or so, I would say that as a company, the only constant thing about it has been change. I mean, it's a bit of a cliche, but it's really true of Dyson. You know, when I joined the company, Dyson was very much a UK vacuum cleaner company. When, you know, if I look at the situation now, we are very much a global technology company, and that's happened in the space of 10 years. But what's interesting during that 10 years is that one of the very constant threads has been IP. You know, it was incredibly important when I first arrived at the company. It was a very much smaller organization then, still a very successful organization at that point. But I remember on the first day that I joined, I was taken along to meet James Dyson, and it became really evident, you know, right at the outset that IP was really very much at the heart of this enterprise, and it remains so now. I don't know that it really changes my approach to the role, but as I said, it certainly sharpens your senses to the fact that the things that you are doing and the decisions you are making really are critically important, and that people within the business right up to James at the top are really going to be interested in those decisions that you're making.
And obviously I knew your predecessor, who you've mentioned very well, and she'd held that role pretty much from the start of the business and developed a very high profile in the IP world. This is Jill Smith. How have you approached the business of filling some really quite big shoes?
Yeah, that's a really good question, Gordon. A really good question, and I agree. They are really quite big shoes. I think if I'm honest, I think the honest answer to that is that I haven't really tried to fill those shoes, and that's been quite deliberate. And it's not because I think it's impossible to fill those shoes. It's probably nearly impossible to fill those shoes if we're honest. But it's more about the fact that if you view it as filling somebody else's shoes, I think the danger is that you are a bit constrained in your thinking, and it inhibits your ability perhaps to think in very different ways. I always think one of the interesting sort of ways to view the sort of filling somebody's shoes metaphor is to view the shoes themselves as kind of a way of doing things. And I think when you look at the shoes in that way, it immediately begs the question whether you really want to fill those shoes or whether you want an entirely different pair of shoes, frankly. And I think that's kind of the decision I took. If I'm honest, I've been sort of helped along the way a little bit, because at Dyson at the moment, I talked about how it's a place that is constantly on the move and constantly changing, and that's equally true of Dyson Legal. And we're going through a bit of a transformation at the moment, and as part of that transformation, we've restructured in a way that has kind of expanded my role beyond IP. And so I sit on top of a vertical now that covers not just IP, but all other aspects of the sort of product life cycle, including things like advertising. And so that's been helpful in a way, because I don't think there really is a genuine comparison to Jill anymore, simply because I don't think we're quite doing the same role, which helps me because, as you were saying, they're pretty big shoes to fill.
I mean, just touching on one of the points you made there, that you've now got advertising under your control. I have encountered in the past with different clients a bit of a divergence sometimes between advertising and IP, particularly on the brand side, where the IP team are saying, please apply the brand guidelines, please be rigid. And the advertisers are saying, well, hold on, we've got to be creative and constructive. Have you encountered that dichotomy at all yet?
Yeah, we absolutely encounter that. I don't think we encounter any tension within my team. I think what we have is that sort of classic tension between, and it's a perfectly understandable tension. It's the classic tension between the marketeers and the lawyers, and it exists in Dyson like it exists everywhere else. And to be honest, my view is that that's a pretty healthy tension, I think, and that if you approach it in the right way and you have a sort of band between you that is under tension, and you're not simply sort of stood apart with no band between you at all, as long as you have that band between you under tension and you can each pull each other in the opposite direction, then I think inevitably you tend to end up in the right place.
That's great. Yeah, that's a very interesting approach. Now, as you said, Dyson's a truly global business now, both in terms of its markets, but also its supply chain and even corporate governance. I mean, HQ is in Singapore. So how does the global nature of the role affect your approach? I mean, obviously, you're not traveling much at the moment, I imagine.
No, I'm not. But actually, I mean, it's interesting that you mentioned that, Gordon, because I do think actually that is one of the key requirements, as I see it, of anybody, frankly, who's in a global role. I mean, we have technology these days, and that technology has come on, leaps and bounds in the past few months for obvious reasons, and so we're able to do calls and video calls and so on and so forth, and that's all very well. But I perhaps I'm old school in this sense, but I think there's no substitution actually for getting out there if you have a global role and meeting your colleagues in the various markets. And that's something that I did a bit of last year, and that I'd planned to do very much more of this year. That hasn't happened. But as we eventually come out of this crisis, that really is very much part of the global role for me, and I anticipate that I'll be getting out and about to markets to kind of meet with our stakeholders and understand really sort of at the coalface what's actually going on, and therefore how we can best support them. I think beyond that sort of basic communication point, I mean, the other thing I would say is that I've obviously, I mean, and it's a pretty trite statement, but I've obviously got to sort of view everything with a global lens, and a really good example of that might be the sort of services that we provide to R&D, and typically we used to do all of our R&D in the UK. We haven't for some time done all of our R&D in the UK, and now we do quite a significant amount in Singapore. We do a significant amount in Malaysia. And so I think that throws up questions around how you best service that demand, and it's incumbent on me to think about all of the available options and whether I need to deploy teams locally or whether I can manage it centrally, and the right balance is what I'm trying to find, and that's part of my role as I see it.
I can tell you from my own experience of having multiple international offices, it is a challenge, and you do need to be there from time to time. I mean, obviously you just can't at the moment, but when you can again, it is one of those things you have to appear in front of people before they
Yeah,
really believe in you.
yeah.
So touching then on that, as we just have done, and obviously right now you've come into this job at an interesting time because you have the added challenge of the COVID epidemic.
Mm.
What are the special challenges of running a very large global team in this environment?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I guess it's a question we're all grappling with at the moment. Um, I think really there were probably three aspects to my approach when it comes to the COVID thing. I think the first thing that I thought was important, and actually the feedback that I've had from the team sort of confirms this, was that I think one of the issues with COVID is just the general lack of clarity and uncertainty for everybody. You know, it's a pretty uncertain situation. It's a fast-moving situation, and right as we were going into lockdown and in the period before lockdown, I mean, it was so dynamic that it was kind of changing every day. I took a decision sort of quite early on, actually, that I would try to just give the team a bit of clarity, because I think the direction of travel at that point was pretty clear. It was pretty clear to me that things were not going to be normal for quite some time. And so I was able to just cut through everything really by getting the team together and just saying, just that, this is not going to be normal for quite some time. So I suggest we now really think very hard about setting ourselves up to work in a very different way. And this was sort of pre-lockdown. So at this point, it hadn't necessarily been mandated, but I just think, you know, it was interesting. The reaction was almost a sort of sigh of relief, you know, that people thought, great, a bit of clarity. Let's not worry about whether we're going into lockdown or not. Let's just set ourselves up to work from home. And that's what we did. And we made sure that people had the right equipment, so that by the time we went into lockdown, we were pretty well set up. I think the next challenge then, I mean, that's the sort of practical side of it. I think the next challenge then for me was to sort of determine how we were going to work. I mean, it was so far from normal that what became clear to me was that any sense of planning for the future beyond the next few weeks was kind of absurd, you know, and you would be in a perpetual state of readjusting your plans. So what I decided to do effectively was to just bring the planning horizon right into a sort of 4-week cycle. And that's what we did. I sort of got the guys together and I said, like, don't worry about the next 6 months, frankly. Worry about the next 4 weeks. Tell me what you're going to do in the next 4 weeks. Tell me how we're going to do it. If we think there are issues with that, we can address it, you know, and I can help you with the practicalities. And then at the end of that 4 weeks, you know what, let's take an assessment of where the world is, and then let's plan the next 4 weeks. And that sort of 4-week cadence, I think, and again, it's about certainty, isn't it? And not looking too far ahead. But I think that has really worked. And I would say that is one of the successes for us within my team.
That makes enormous sense to me, and that sounds like a real role model way of dealing with this issue. I mean, there are so many uncertainties and remain so many uncertainties. It is very difficult. Sometimes I get asked to think about what's going to happen in January, say, and you just can't say, can you? It's impossible. So you obviously, as you said right at the beginning, you started out in private practice and worked for some time in that area. I think that those of us who have always remained in private practice struggle occasionally to picture how the business of running an in-house team would work. What would you identify as the most different challenges that you think you face as head of an in-house team, as opposed to somebody in private practice who heads a team? What do you think are the differences?
I think, I mean, and this is a question that I get asked fairly often, actually. And it's not necessarily an easy question to answer in a sort of, you know, in just a few lines. I think very high level, what I say to people is that the principal difference, I think, between an in-house department and a private practice, even if those teams are the same in terms of size, is that for the in-house department, you will almost inevitably be a smaller part of a much larger machine. Now, I know that there are private practices that are very large. I know there are law firms that are very large, but if not larger in terms of scale, then certainly larger in its sense of sort of diversity. So within the enterprise, you are going to have large teams operating in the markets, operating in security, operating in IT, operating in R&D, all of these very different teams that have very different aims, interests, and drivers compared to the legal team. And I think that for me is the principal difference. I mean, it's interesting. The answer to this question might have been different sort of 5 years ago than it is now, because I think the other thing about working in-house is that it's really in a state of flux at the moment, I would say, to a degree. I mean, I read an article, I think it was in The Economist a few weeks ago. I was really struck by some of the statistics in that article, and one in particular, which said that the S&P 500 index value, 61% of the value of that index was actually tied up in intangibles. Now, what's really interesting about that is that that's not even tech companies. You know, it's not just tech companies in that index. You know, and what that says to me is that it's actually a very different place now for CEOs, and by extension, the whole of the C-suite, including chief legal officers or general counsels, that it was, say, 25 years ago, perhaps even 10 years ago. You know, it's no longer for these guys just about making decisions around capital investment. It's about data. It's about brand identity. It's about disruptive innovation. And obviously that brings opportunities for us. I mean, it's a great time, I think, to be working in the IP sector. You know, I think this is a really fantastic time, but it also brings risks, like everything. You know, with opportunities come risks. And I think one of the really interesting risks around this sort of pivot towards intangibles within the context of a big organization and a big enterprise is that you start to see overlap. Between what would typically have been the remit of an IP team, and you start to see overlap with other teams. You know, and things like data governance become important, and things like cyber security become important. You know, and those guys do a job which is close to the job that we do in the IP team. It doesn't really overlap, but what tends to happen is that because the C-suite are not necessarily, you know, as clued up about what IP is all about, you get the word IP thrown around, and you get it thrown around in the context of data governance. You get it thrown around in the context of cybersecurity. And so I think one of the really important things in an in-house IP team at the moment is to really be clear about your value proposition and really differentiate it and work hard to differentiate it from some of these other value propositions, which on the face of it seem very similar to the C-suite, but actually, as we know, are quite different. Trade secrets is not just the same as data governance. It's not just a subset of data governance. And so I think there's that sense that you have to differentiate yourself and properly identify your value proposition. And once you identify your value proposition, then you've got to execute and you've got to deliver on that. And when you're talking about dealing with the C-suite, you know, you need to put in place some pretty solid metrics that are going to demonstrate to those guys that you are delivering on that. It's no use just saying that you're delivering on that. And those metrics need to be simple, and that's pretty difficult in the IP sphere, as we know. It's very difficult sometimes to reduce IP to a very simple set of metrics, but that's kind of what we need to do. Yeah. And then I think there's almost, sorry, go on, Gordon.
No. I'm you continue. I don't want to interrupt.
Well, I was just going to say, I mean, I talk about differentiation and differentiating yourself from other parts of the organization. And then there's a slight conundrum, I think. There's a flip side to that, which is that the other challenge that you have working in-house is that of trying to compete with other very large projects when you're trying to get access to resource. So a really good example of that is sort of IT resource. You know, and the IT guys are working on some pretty big infrastructure projects. And if you're going to be able to get any of that resource, you're going to have to demonstrate that you've got critical mass. And so at the same time that you're trying to differentiate yourself from some of these other guys, you then have to sort of club together where it's appropriate and build up critical mass, you know, perhaps with the guys like data governance, to try and coalesce around something that you can pitch to other parts of the organization in order to get support. And so you're constantly trying to find the right balance, I think, the right mix between differentiating what you do and working with others in a way that enables you to do what you want to do.
Yeah, I think you mentioned IT and you mentioned cybersecurity, and these are two areas which have caused a lot of overlap, haven't they? So IP can no longer sit on a little island all of its own. And I think the prominence of trade secrets as an important aspect of IP has sort of developed that even further, because obviously it goes hand in hand sometimes with cybersecurity and what have you. Now, Dyson has always been a patenting company, but do you nonetheless, have a sharp eye on trade secrets and the importance of making sure they are protected?
Yeah, it's a good question, Gordon. It's something I've thought about myself. I don't think historically that it's been at the forefront of our minds, if I'm honest. And I think your characterization of us as a patenting company is an accurate one. I think it's very much more in our minds now as we move forward. It's certainly in my mind, and I think again, you need to find the right balance. I think there's space for everything in the toolkit. There's space for patents, there's space for designs. Obviously, you've got to try and protect the brand, but I think there's space for other things such as trade secrets. And so I think going forward, it's going to be increasingly important that we have a sort of mature structure in place that allows us to keep those trade secrets secret, frankly.
Yeah.
And that's difficult. It's difficult because there's a lack of maturity within the organization generally, a lack of understanding as to what trade secrets are even about. So it's a pretty big undertaking to get to a point where you have a level of maturity, but I think it's critically important.
Just going back to the management of the team then, I mean, obviously structure is inevitably something of a pyramid. So how do you go about kind of creating a career path for young and ambitious lawyers and patent attorneys within an in-house team?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, we could probably spend half an hour talking about people development, Gordon. I mean, it's something that occupies a lot of my waking time.
A couple of minutes.
Yeah, because it's really important. I think if I was just going to sort of be brief, I think my impression is that guys fall into two buckets. They are either concerned about developing themselves, and the main goal for those guys is just experiencing new things and trying different things and getting exposure to different opportunities. And in a sense, the career path then becomes quite non-linear and opportunities open up, and then they take those opportunities, and that's probably a bucket that I'm in. But there's another bucket, and people are very clear that they're in this bucket, which is more of a sort of linear approach to careers, where the focus for those guys really is the role immediately above them. And so the question is, how do I get to that role? And they accept that they have to do some development, but in a sense, it's a means to an end. I think the first bucket is much easier to deal with than the second bucket in an organization like mine, and probably in any organization. And we're doing quite a bit of the stuff at the moment to work on sort of people development, and as a leadership team, we're doing a lot of stuff around that, and I think we're doing some pretty good stuff around that. And for people who are interested in non-linear career progression, I think that in itself goes a long way to resolving their concerns. I think there's always going to be the challenge around people who want a very linear path, and there's nothing wrong with that. And for me, that ultimately comes down to sort of honest conversations, I think. I mean, some of the conversations I've had have been about, look, I'm going to support you, whether your future is here or elsewhere, but it's in my interest to develop you. And I'm going to say that this is a good place to work, and I'm going to try and make it a good place to work. But if it's not a good place to work, then let me support you to find your career elsewhere.
Yes, it all comes down to the single core thing, doesn't it? When you're running a team, which is you need to know that team. You've got to know which bucket they're sitting in order to be able to run them through.
Yeah.
Looking outside the organisation, you've recently run a process to sort of rationalise your panel of external advisors, but you've still got quite a lot around the world. So how are you going to keep them all on their toes?
Yeah, it's been a really interesting process. This actually, I think it's been a really good process. I think, and we're still, honestly, I think we're still kind of finding our way a little bit. with this. It's early days. For me, I think there's a bit of a tension, I think, as somebody sat as a sort of functional head rather than sat in the sort of legal ops role. I think there's a bit of an inevitable tension between the drive to keep costs down, which is part of what, you know, running a panel is about. I mean, let's be honest about that. I think there's a tension between that and maintaining the sorts of relationships that you need to maintain, so that if something really big happens, you know that you can pick up a phone to a guy who understands Dyson, he understands the history, he or she knows how we work, and therefore can get moving straight away. And I do think there's a kind of tension between those things, and I kind of view my role as trying to sort of manage that tension between those two things. And I think my approach to it is to kind of think not in terms of cost, but in terms of value. So we're not necessarily trying to drive down costs. What I think we are trying to drive is value. And I think when you think of it in those terms, and it's no longer a race to the bottom, then it becomes a little easier to maintain some of those relationships. I think ultimately that's what we need to try to do.
Yeah, I mean, I think we certainly from our side of the fence would like to see more of that, where an appreciation of value, you know, as you said, and not the race to the bottom, which can sometimes occur. Simon, this has been really, really interesting. To conclude, would you say that you have an underlying philosophy of management, a sort of set of principles which you can apply to most situations to get you through?
Wow. I don't know whether I have a sort of clear management philosophy. I mean, there's been plenty of books written on that, and I'm certainly no scholar in that area. I mean, what I think I would say is this: I have a couple of principles that I do tend to find that I can apply to most situations. And the first, and they're kind of overlapping. And the first principle is have a clear goal, and the second principle, which I think is really key, is empower people to meet that goal. Now, it sounds like a very simple statement, but when we talk about goal in this context, that actually covers pretty big things, you know, designing a whole operating model for a legal department, but it can also cover really small things. You know, and what a lot of my guys will probably say to you, it's become almost a running joke, is that I'm constantly asking the question, what are we trying to achieve? You know, whether it's a big project or a really small bit of sort of admin process that we're trying to improve, what are we trying to achieve? I think is a really fundamental question. And then when it comes to empowerment, you know, I think there's a lot of stuff to sort of unpick there and sort of unpack. You know, it's really about people. It's about making sure that you develop people, and it comes back to this development point. You need to have good people, and if you don't have people who are good enough, then that's really a development challenge for you. And you have to sort of get those people to the right place where you can trust them to make decisions. But then even when you have good people, I think there's probably a process aspect to that empowerment as well. And you've got to think a little bit about governance, you know, and you've got to have a relatively mature approach to governance if you're going to let people go around making decisions and empowering them to make decisions. So I think under those sort of very simple principles, there's a lot of detail. But if you're asking me, what do I constantly think about when I go into any situation? Have a clear goal, empower people to meet it.
I think that's really, really interesting and insightful advice, and thank you very much. Thank you, Simon, for sharing your thoughts with us today. I have found that absolutely fascinating and truly insightful. I very much look forward to seeing how things evolve for you and Dyson in the years to come. But one thing I definitely know is that Dyson's very impressive IP portfolio is in really good hands. I'll be back soon with another guest in conversation with Gowling WLG. So thank you to everyone who's joined us for this event today, and thank you, Simon.